Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Nacho Problems, where we turn an ordinary recipe into extraordinary nachos. I'm Nacho Queen, but you can call me Em. I've got some good news for this episode. While my cameraman is still off of his feet, he did lend me a new camera, so we're going to have two different angles and maybe some better shots. Let's see how it works. So, you guys loved the idea of breakfast nachos so much last week that I thought, hey, let's do it again. This week we are making cinnamon roll nachos. Let's get started. Step 1, the chips. For one batch of about 4 to 6 servings of the chips, we are going to need 3/4 of a cup of milk, 1 egg, 6 tablespoons of butter divided, 3 cups of bread flour, 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt, half a cup of brown sugar, and 2 teaspoons of cinnamon. I initially used yeast because that's what my recipe calls for, but in my second, more successful attempt, I left it out because we don't need the dough to rise, because we actually want it to be flat so we can get a nice crust on it. Now I'm going to be using my bread machine to make up my dough for me, but you can always mix all the ingredients yourself and use either a stand mixer with dough hooks or good old-fashioned elbow grease. First, let's add our milk and our sugar. Next, we're going to crack our egg into a cup and beat it slightly before adding it in. Now we're going to add 3 tablespoons of our butter that we've diced up into little cubes. Then add in our salt and finally our flour. I'm going to pop all that into my bread machine and set it to the dough setting and go take a break for an hour and a half. And by break, I mean laundry, dishes, and 50 or so other things on my to-do list. And we're back. Now let's just tip the dough out onto our clean counter. Okay, more like shake it out. Now we're going to sprinkle some flour down and then roll out our dough. Now, you don't have to make your own cinnamon roll dough. You can always buy the pre-made stuff at the store, but I'd look for the smaller cans if you can find them. The grands might end up making monster-sized chips. Okay, moving on. Now we've softened our 3 tablespoons of remaining butter, and now we're going to spread it out all over the dough. Try to get a nice and even layer. And now combine your brown sugar and your cinnamon together, and then sprinkle that evenly over the dough. Next, we're going to roll it up. Now for our purposes, it's important to roll it nice and tightly. Next, we need to cut it into thin rolls. We'll start by cutting off the flat ends. After all, those are more burrito than a nacho shape, so we'll save those for when I create a spin-off show called Burrito Burdens. Next, we're going to cut the remaining dough into fairly thin slices. Don't worry about getting it super thin, I've got a plan for that. The first time I did this, I tried freezing the roll to make it easier to slice into thin chips, but that didn't work out as well as I hoped, so I think this method is going to be much easier and produce better results. So now we're going to flatten out our rolls into chips. Here are 2 methods. First, you want to use some wax paper so that your roll doesn't stick to either the counter or your rolling pin. So we're just going to place the cinnamon roll in between the wax paper and now roll it out nice and flat. This is going to produce a crispier chip. Now the next method is using another one of my wide assortment of kitchen gadgets, a tortilla press. Again, you still want to use some wax paper and you're just going to press it down and it comes out nice and flat. I think I like this method better as it produces a more regular shape with less work, so let's make some more of these. I thought I'd just do a few for one plate and save the rest for another attempt, but I actually found that if you let the dough sit, even in the fridge or freezer for some time, the filling starts to ooze out, so it's better to cook them all fresh if you can. Now I tried 3 methods of cooking these. I'll show you just the results for the first 2 methods and then the full video of the most successful. First, I tried to bake them in the oven. They turned out okay this way, but they puffed up, making them more like a thin cinnamon roll and less like a chip. Then I tried grilling them on my mini grill. Again, they just didn't end up as thin as I was hoping they'd be, and the reason I want them fairly thin is because you'll get more of a crisp on them if they are. Okay, now we're going to try pan frying them in some butter. We'll put our small frying pan over medium heat and let it warm up a bit. Then we're going to add a small pat of butter and put in a few of our flattened rolls. It's important not to put too many in, as we'll be further flattening them during cooking and they need room to expand. Leave them for just a bit to form a crust and then flip them and press them flat. Do this several times until you get a nice crisp crust on both sides. Be careful, due to the sugar in them, they can burn very easily. Don't leave them on either side for too long and don't have them on high heat. You'll need to wipe your pan clean between every batch, or leftover sugar from one batch will burn and make the next batch bitter. Okay, so that's our chips done. Let's move on to step 2, the cheese. For our cheese, we're going to make a cream cheese frosting and then thin it out a little using some heavy cream so that it can be drizzled on top. Here's what we'll need. About 1 tablespoon of butter softened, a 1/4 cup of cream cheese about room temperature, about 2 tablespoons powdered sugar depending on how sweet you want it. You might call this icing or confectioner sugar, 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract, and some heavy cream. This might be called whipping cream, and while not exactly the same thing, double cream would also work. You could also use half and half as well, just know that you will need less of it to thin out your frosting. Now, I have no idea why my carton of cream looks like that, but I can assure you that Lawrence the lopsided carton will also make an appearance in episode 4. Now let's get started with beating our butter until it's nice and fluffy. Now add in your cream cheese and beat them together. As you can see, my hand mixer is one of my older and more stubborn appliances. Its cord does whatever it wants and regularly annoys me. But it still works, so there's no sense in replacing it yet. Okay, now we need to add in our sugar. Sorry, I needed to put on my apron. Anytime you work with powdered sugar, you should wear an apron, as it has a tendency to get everywhere. When beating it into something, always start on your lowest speed to avoid it ending up in a big cloud of dust and you having to wash sugar out of your hair. Before moving on, we need to taste it to see if the sweetness is where we want it. Next, add in the vanilla. Now you can absolutely use imitation vanilla if that's what you have, but if you can, spring for some high quality vanilla. Treat yourself. You deserve it. Yes, it is more expensive, but I find you get a richer flavor from using less, so it's worth it. I personally like Bahamian vanilla best, but Mexican and Madagascar vanilla, which is what I have here, are both really good too. I'm tempted to try making my own, but we'll leave that project for another day. Finally, we'll add in our cream. Start by adding just a splash and then fully incorporate it before you add more. Don't forget to scrape the sides of your bowl for even mixing. We're going to add a little more because this is still too thick. We want a nice consistency to drizzle over our chips, but still thick enough that it won't just run right off. You might want to use a hand whisk for this bit so that you don't overbeat it. This looks good, so let's set that aside and move on to step 3, the toppings. Okay, for our toppings, we're going to make candied pecans. These are another of those things that you might want to make up some extras because they are just really good to munch on. For these, we are going to need 1 cup of pecan halves, 3 tablespoons of brown sugar, a 1/4 teaspoon of salt, 3/4 teaspoon of cinnamon, a 1/4 teaspoon of vanilla, and 1 tablespoon of water. You can also add a pinch of cayenne if you like that sweet and spicy combination. As you can see, we've lined a baking sheet with a silicone mat. If you don't have one of these, tin foil should work as well. Add all of your ingredients except your pecans to the pan and cook over medium heat for about a minute until it starts to bubble. Break up any little chunks of brown sugar that you have. Now pour in your pecans and completely coat them in your sauce. Stir constantly for about 2 to 3 minutes until your pecans look shiny and smell nutty. Careful not to burn them. Now scrape them out onto your lined baking sheet and spread them out into a single layer and leave them to cool. It's that simple. Okay, time for the best part. Step 4. Let's eat. Okay, let's take our plate and add on some of our chips. Important note, when you remove your chips from the pan, do not stack them as they tend to stick together. Now we're going to break apart our pecans into smaller pieces. I was going to put them on first, but then I changed my mind and decided cheese first. So let's just drizzle on some of this. Now we're going to add our pecans. And there we have it. I felt this was a good shareable size plate, but my taste testers for this recipe, Old Son and Young Son, disagreed and would have been glad to have each had a plate to themselves. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. If so, please consider sharing with a friend. If you have an idea for a future video, you can leave a comment below, or better yet, tag me on Twitter. I'm at NachoProblemsYT. Now friends, it's 38 degrees and rainy outside, and yet the dog is still demanding a walk. But I'm hoping for most of you at least, that's not your problem. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.